My name is Florian Eckersdorfer, and I want to talk about streams in Gulp.js. As you might know, Gulp.js is a build system or task runner, if you want to call it. And I want to start with just a moment explaining what Gulp.js is so that everyone is up to speed. So, there are lots of different task runners, build systems that like GNU make. So it's just the basic use of this is you just have tasks you have to do over and over and over again, and you don't want to type these complicated commands all the time. So you use, for example, something like make, and you compress them into one simple command and then execute this one command, and all your commands are executed automatically. So GNU make is quite popular, or the only thing that is used by C programs and libraries. But for example, there's Ant or Maven in the Java world, or Phing in the PHP world, or Rake in the Ruby world, or Grunt in the JavaScript world. But Gulp is a little bit different than, for example, Grunt, for two main reasons. So the first is that Gulp uses code instead of configuration. So in Ant or in Phing, for example, you have XML files, or in Grunt you define JavaScript objects to configure your tasks. But in Gulp, you just write JavaScript code. But the second point is a lot more important, and I want to focus on that Gulp uses Node.js streams. And so I don't want to go in the nitty-gritty details of Node.js streams. I just want to focus on the parts that are used, or how it is used in Gulp. So basically what it means is just like watching a YouTube video. You don't want to wait for example, the video to download completely and then watch it. You want to watch it while it's downloading. And the same thing you can do with every operation that needs some kind of I/O. So it doesn't have to be a download from the internet. It could also be reading a file from disk, or reading a lot of files from disk. So for example, if you want to read 1,000 CSS files, you can, with streams, you can operating on the first CSS file immediately after this one file has loaded. And while the other ones are still loading, you can already operate on this one that is already finished loading. So let's look at a quick example what we typically do in a JavaScript world with build tasks, so what we need. So let's say we have CoffeeScript files and write CoffeeScript code in our application. So first we need to compile that to JavaScript. For our production environment, we need to probably concatenate it into one big file, minify it in some way, and often have to copy it some kind of dist or public directory so that it's accessible by the web server. So a traditional task runner would do it like this. It would first read all the .coffee files, invoke the CoffeeScript compiler, and then save JavaScript files somewhere in a temp directory. Then it would read all the files from the temp directory, concatenate them, and then save them into a, let's say, all.js file. The next step, we read the all.js file, minify them, and then write an all.min.js file. And in the last step, we need to move that file to the dist directory. So, and each step invokes reading and writing. So that's a lot of overhead, because basically we already have in memory. Why should we use the code in memory? Why we have to write it to disk before and then read it again? That's stupid. So that's where the Gulp.js comes in, and how streams allow us to do this more efficiently. Basically, we start reading all .coffee files. And when one file is read, this is piped through the CoffeeScript compiler. So the pipe in Gulp.js is like the pipe character when you run Unix commands and you concatenate multiple commands into one big command. You use the pipe character to do that, and the pipe function in Gulp.js does basically the same. It takes the output from one function and gives it as input to another function. So then we pipe it through concat, we pipe it through minify, and then we save it to the dist directory. So that's like once reading from memory once, and reading from disk once, and writing disk once, and not in each step. We save a lot of time there, especially if you have like really big projects with a lot of files and a lot of steps, and so we don't want to read and write every step. So that's the code written from what I described earlier. So basically what we do is we define, we use the Gulp source function to define like the files we want to read. And of course it's useful to have like stars, or we can pass like star.coffee, so read every .coffee file from this directory. We could also pass an array with it, so we could like individual files or arrays of files or arrays of directories, so it's a lot of possibilities to read files. Then, so what this Gulp source does basically is it reads the files one by one and turns them into objects. And then it passes these objects through this pipeline of functions. And again, it takes the output of one function and gives it to the as input to the next function. And yeah, it's quite straightforward. So it's, you can easily see what this task does when you just look at it quickly. And Gulp is really dealing, right? It has like 4 or 5 public methods, so it's not like a really big program. It's like really simple, but it uses a lot of libraries, and I want to go into detail in some of them. So the first one is Orchestrator, which is like the part that does the task running, and like Gulp can run tasks asynchronously and synchronously and so on. But yeah, that's had nothing to do with streams, so we skip that one. But the second is Vinyl, and Vinyl is a virtual file format. So basically what it does, it is an abstraction layer to the file system. So it offers some functions to read and write to the file system and from the file system, but like in a not specific way. So you could replace file system with S3, Amazon S3, or Dropbox, or whatever. So it's not specific to the Node.js functions for reading and writing files. It's just an abstraction layer on top of it. And these virtual files, so they encapsulate the file system, these objects, and in practice this means that the Gulp source function is just a wrapper for the vinyl.source function. And the Gulp.dest function is just a wrapper for the vinyl.dest function. So all this reading and writing all happens in Vinyl. So it's like an essential part of Gulp. And it's developed by the same people that develop Gulp, but you could use it separately. So we want some more code, I think. So I thought about what can we do to like demonstrate how the streams work and what they do. And this is a Gulp plugin. So the basic idea of Gulp is that it has no logic whatsoever in it. It's just this source, dest, pipe functions, and the watch function to react on when something changes in the file system. But it's just these 5 functions or whatsoever. And everything else is plugins. So if you want to compile SAS, you need a plugin. If you want to concatenate files, you need a plugin. If you want to compile CoffeeScript, you need a plugin. Everything is a plugin. And they all look basically like this. So this is like a very basic plugin. So what we have first is this is through2. This is a library that is like a wrapper around the streams API from Node, because it's like a little bit messy and a little bit complicated in some cases. So this is just a wrapper around it, and so that we don't have to worry about the problems of the Node streams API. And this is like the real plugin. This is a log function which basically takes this vinyl, this file object is like a vinyl file object. It's just a JavaScript object. And it takes this function and it prints the path, like the file name, onto the console. That's everything this plugin does. And this call is very important, because this call says, the callback says, okay, I'm done. Give this file to the next function in the pipeline. So whenever this callback, which is a parameter to the log function, so Gulp calls this with this callback. Whenever this callback is called, the next item in the pipeline, so this file is passed to the next function in the pipeline. Yeah. So that's our really simple program. And you also see this name is like an option. So we define that in the Gulp file, and then whenever we print the file path, the name is also printed. So what we want to do is we want to use this in our task that I've shown earlier, and Now, before each function, I call this log function to just see how our file objects, our vinyl file objects, flow through this program. So we can visualize this. Okay. I've taken a screenshot of how this looks because I can annotate it easily here. So what we first see is that the bar coffee file is read and passed through the CoffeeScript compiler. And then it's immediately passed, this bar it's converted to JavaScript, and it's passed to the concat function. But then what we then see is that it's not further processed. The reason is, if you want to concatenate files, you need to, so the concat function buffers all the inputs. So it removes the file objects from the pipeline, buffers the content of these objects, and then, and it calls just the coffee and concat functions for all files. And then it passes an all min file to the next thing, so to the Agify, which is a minifier. It passes it to the all min.js. So it waits until the last file arrived, and then it creates a new file object, and virtual file object that is not stored on disk anywhere yet, and passes it in the pipeline further. So basically what we can do is we can call Gulp log, and then we see each file is processed, and it's really quick because with 3 files it doesn't really matter, but if you have a lot of files and maybe your tasks, I don't know if you want to compile like really big SAS files or CoffeeScript compile really big Coffees files, it takes a while. And so it's really nice that you don't have to wait for the I/O to finish before you can before your code is executed. So that's basically my talk. Thank you very much. So I have here 2 links for you. The one is like the Stream Handbook, which is just a general introduction to the Node.js streams. So because in Gulp, basically we only use we stream on a file-by-file basis. Because compiling CoffeeScript, for example, to JavaScript, it doesn't make any sense to do this on a line-by-line, on a byte-by-byte basis. You need a whole file to compile it. So every plugin or most plugins operate on a file-by-file basis. But in theory, for example, if you're doing chat software, something like that, you can stream single files or single lines of text to a client or something like that. And the second is like a post on Medium by one of the core devs of Gulp, where he explains a little bit which libraries are used in Gulp and how they relate to each other. And this is my speaker deck account where I will post these slides. Any questions? Yeah.
You showed us that you always start a task with the source function, and you always finish the task with the dest function.
Yeah.
Is it necessary to terminate it with the dest function?
No.
Is it possible
Absolutely
to return a pipe to the next task or something like that?
Yeah. For example, I mean, in most tasks like building JavaScript or CSS code or something like that, it's you want to have some output. But let's say you do unit testing with Gulp. So you have a Gulp task that runs a unit test. You maybe just want to you pipe it to some reporter function that just displays it nicely in the console. So it doesn't have to write it somewhere. It can also evaporate into nothing.
And would it be possible to return the pipe containing the compiled CoffeeScript files?
Yeah, you could. Yes. So if you have, let's look up. So you could, for example, remove this here and add a return here, and then you could, or just move this code into a function and then call this function here. And for example, if you let's say this task is only executed in production and this is executed always, then you could move this into a function and call this function in one build prod and one build dev task. And and one is here like write to prod and one to write to def or something like that. So you can, it's code, so you can do anything with it. And yeah, also, yeah.
So I'm trying to understand like what's the key advantage of Gulp. Like I've never used it.
Yeah.
I'm used to make files for C,
Yeah.
C++. So I guess if you would just take a make file and rewrite it as a Gulp file, it would be some overhead. But the key advantage is, as I understand it, that you're more flexible with Gulp. Is this correct, or did I?
No, I mean, I was also I used make files for a long time into developing JavaScript and web stuff. But the main advantage is, as I mentioned earlier, that if you use a make file, you always have to invoke for example, the CoffeeScript command line tool. Yeah, and so this tool has its own read and write mechanisms. So you have to read the files from disk. So or this, if you call your make file is basically just like a like you concatenate multiple command line commands after each other. But and for example, the CoffeeScript thing has like, okay, a read and a write a part to it. So it reads from disk, files from disk, compiles them, and then writes them to disk. So then that's what I shown earlier. That.
So are you saying that the key advantage is that you don't have to use the file system as much?
Yeah, that you don't have to. I mean that you don't have to write to the file system in each step.
Yeah, okay, I see that this is an advantage, but I don't care. I mean, then I use 100 megabytes more and I delete it again. So
no, it does make
no,
a difference.
Time. You have to. I mean, if you're developing like JavaScript applications, you want to have something like live reload or browser sync, where when you save the JavaScript file, your browser window immediately updates, and then you care if the compile step takes 5 seconds or 500 milliseconds. Because
is it really that much faster?
Yeah.
You use a SSD.
Yeah.
I converted just recently. So when Roland asked me if I could talk here, I was telling him, yeah, I'm just rewriting our build system in Gulp, and so I'm doing a lot of Gulp stuff. And I mean, there were differences from like tasks that run for, I don't know, 75 seconds, and I got them down to like 1 second. Cool. I mean, it also depends, of course, that you can do some things in the background and you don't need it, and so the browser can reload even if some other stuff is still compiling because I don't need it that quickly. But yeah, it's a lot faster. Yeah.
First of all, full disclosure, I'm more of a backend Java Scala developer, coming more to the front end. And because you mentioned one of the build tools was Ant.
Yeah.
And we were using Ant 10 years ago, and one of the drawbacks of using Ant was that when you would come to a big project, everybody would do things different. So understanding a build process was a very huge task, and therefore we developed, in the Java backend community, tools like Maven, for instance, which actually standardize on a series of steps for a build process, like prepare sources, compile sources. And I want to ask you, or everybody here, if in the JavaScript world something similar is developing in that direction. Because
JavaScript.
Well, no standards. That's important.
Well, to come into a new project and to understand how to build, because you said you're working on a build process.
Yeah.
So, are you writing the whole code for that build process, or are there any Gulp libraries which would allow you to import that library, and then it would support? Okay, if you have a coffee script directory, then it will. Some.
Of course. So basically, the idea of Gulp basically is just like these 5 functions of code that you show on the screen. There's one watch function, but you have seen every function that Gulp has to offer. You have seen in this presentation.
Sure, but what I'm finding is that as I'm learning myself, I have to copy actually code, Gulp code, to actually compile my CoffeeScript or TypeScript.
That's standard procedure.
So that's violating the don't repeat yourself rule in the sense that
but as you,
it's a pattern that we're all doing it here, and we all in our Gulp.js have 5 lines or 10 lines,
Probably more.
or more that actually does this work, and we actually want to do the same.
Yeah.
So, are there any initiatives or anything that is building on top of this, in the sense of that I can import and say
Build a framework.
What?
You should build a
No,
framework.
I'm not that. but I think it's a pain point everybody here has.
Yeah,
I think
but I mean, it depends a little bit what you're doing. So, for example, what I did when I mentioned like I'm rewriting a huge build process is that I'm doing like code that is like similar or that has to be repeated often. I'm creating a new plugin for that. Because as you've seen before, the plugin is really simple. And so I just moving code into a plugin. And then I can reuse it all the time. So then I don't have to repeat it myself. And we have like a small Gulp plugin repository in our company that we just use in each project. And we can just have our basic tasks that are specific to our code. So our backend is written in PHP, and there are like all these tasks to, I don't know, clear the cache of PHP, the APC cache, and I don't know, build doctrine databases and whatnot. And we all have plugins for that, so that we can just, I don't know, say, build doctrine here, like one word, build doctrine, and it's done. Because it already knows all the stuff.
So there is still not any consolidation on
It's
on
too early for that.
Okay.
There is a huge difference. Some people are writing in ES5, some people are writing in ES6, some people are writing in TypeScript, some people organize their cascades, the cascading style sheets with Sass, someone with less, someone move the different elements, some would prefer to do CDNs for some of the libraries, some not. It's too early.
Okay.
It's changing too fast to standardize something. What you have is a lot of plugins that already solve a lot of these problems, and you combine these plugins.
So, for example, there's a public plugin for, I don't know, PHP unit tests, and for, I don't know, maybe even JUnit tests. So there are plugins for that you can just drop in one line of code, and then this task executes PHP unit tests or JUnit tests.
What you can use is Yeoman. So you have a complete template for a project. So you have a destination folder, already a Gulp file with all these lines with everything. And you're just editing your files. And the main work for the infrastructure is already done by the skeleton.
So it's like a scaffolding tool that like generates your build file and your folder structure and imports the basic packages you use in every project and so on. Yeah.
So can you replicate streams or write a plugin that does not consume the stream unless it's continuous? Have like side effects where
Yeah, of course. So you can, this file object is just a JavaScript file object. So basically you do with it whatever you want. So you can just create you can add new functions to it, or you can add properties to it. So for example, linters that like lint your CSS or JavaScript code, they just add a lint.errors message or property to the file object, and then for example some other task can read this property and say and give out an error message if this file has lint errors. And as I mentioned, for example, the concat you see here, it just removes every file object it receives from the stream and creates a new file object and then adds this one to the stream or emits it like it's event based.
can these things run then in parallel? I mean, in theory,
Yes. Yes. I mean, I don't know how this in the background, but they're like asynchronous, so that I don't know how parallel Node.js is really, but it could work. For example, if you basically you could, for example, have two Gulp tasks that both start a background shell script task, and then they would run like two shell. I mean, of course, you have only one or two CPUs, so yeah. But
you might want to add all Gulp tasks are running per default parallel.
yeah.
So if you want to run two tasks serial, you need to add them explicitly as a dependency to each other.
okay, so it is parallel.
It is parallel.
But I don't know, is it really parallel or just? I mean, it's not like. I don't think that JavaScript or Node.js is really parallel. It's just, I mean, fake parallel, isn't it?
I can't tell you that.
Does someone know? Is Node.js really parallel, or is it just, so if you have two cores in your computer, or four does for.
No, it doesn't use it.
No. The development, it's fake parallel.
It does use it if you're using the cluster module, which is basically the same as
But your application doesn't run clustered unless you cluster it. Your application still is going to run your build system. It's still going to be on only one node instance.
Yeah.
Unless magically.
But if you have different tasks, one for example for JavaScript and one for cascading style sheets, and you start both of them with the tasks that summarize both, you can see that it does in parallel the JavaScript and the cascading style sheets.
If you have this output, you see in the Gulp output that is parallel, but it's like parallel that, for example, if the CPU is waiting on I/O from one thing, then it switches to the next. And so.
Okay. They have to be independent.
Yeah. Guys, alle gleich einen Applaus. We'll right now have one short talk and then we have pizza.
Yeah.